we're not prepared for it. No one is prepared for it. Everyone is just whistling past the graveyard.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. On today's show, we're talking to Denis Campbell, the editor of UK Progressive and the author of the new book, Donald Trump Deplorable Bully, 45 Shameful Weeks of POTUS 45. The whole book was dedicated to ensuring that we don't normalise Donald Trump's behaviour as president. He is committed to the idea that this should not be considered the new norm. We also spoke a little bit about Boris Johnson, about Theresa May, and about the current crisis going on in UK government. If you like the show, don't forget to like and subscribe to us on YouTube, Facebook, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts, and wherever you follow us or want to follow us on social media. So let's get on with the podcast. So yeah, Denis, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming back on. It's nice to chat to you again.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Well, after you released your book, which we'll drop the shameless plug for straight away, I was keen to get you on a chat about what you wrote about there, and then sort of get your assessment of our current political situation on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay.
So if we want to start just with Theresa May. Last time you were here, you made the prediction that she wouldn't survive conference season.
Yep. Well, yeah. Sometimes you get them wrong, but there's making it through by the skin of your teeth, and there's also being an effective leader. And she's clearly proving daily that she's not going to be effectively able to lead us out of Brexit or through the Brexit process. That the carnage is now beginning to become known. If you lose Aston Martin and you lose the ability to produce cars in this country because of a hard Brexit tumbling out with no agreement, how are they going to get their roadworthiness certificate? What's going to happen if you don't have a customs agreement for all of these automotive companies that need parts? And those parts come from all different parts of Europe. And if they're hung up for a week or more in the port, that's going to affect the economy as well. And this is before you even factor in what the head of Goldman Sachs, tweeted when he was visiting in Frankfurt and saying basically he's going to enjoy being there. All summer long, key executives from major companies in a variety of industries, from investment bankers to, the top 11 people from Amazon, were relocated to the Czech Republic because there's no way any global company is going to find themselves stuck here in the UK without trade agreements that allow them to be a European-wide power. They want to deal with 500 million people in 27 countries. And I don't care who Britain is, nobody is going to stick around on an island if they don't think that island is part of something bigger that's going to benefit them. So this idea that the sun never sets on the British Empire is a false one. And the idea that they need us more than we need them, the 27 countries have clearly said, no, we don't need you.
What do you think? Now, you talked there about the no deal idea, which is truly terrifying. But do you think the fact that Parliament will now get a vote will make a no deal more or less likely? Because ultimately it could mean that Parliament will never ratify anything that the hard Brexiteers in the cabinet put forward, and therefore they're never likely to sort of rubber stamp it? Or do you think it's kind of the politicians will respect the result of the referendum, whatever that means, and just push through whatever happens? Do you think it makes it more likely that we'll get a hard Brexit or less?
I think as people this is one of the reasons why Theresa May called a snap election back when she did in September, because they wanted to get a veto-proof majority, something that would give them strength to push this thing through. Because when people began to see how bad this process was going and how bad a deal this was going to end up being for Britain, you're never going to get a better deal than the one you have right now. So the question becomes, why are you going to risk your entire economy over this? I mean, Bank of England came out a couple of weeks ago and said the impact on day one is 10,000 lost jobs, and in the first year, 75,000. If they're willing to go on the line and say that, it's going to be much, much worse. And, we're just watching our politicians whistle past the graveyard because they're just going to be stubborn, arrogant prigs that aren't going to budge an inch because they know they're right and nobody else knows what this means, and nor should they be listened to.
Yeah, I think you probably sum up the feeling of quite a lot of people at the moment. When you, with what the Bank of England said, and with what numerous different industries, or with what you were saying about Aston Martin, do you think that people are still turned off to the idea that this is just still Project Fear, that this is, oh yeah, Brexit causes everything, sort of fear mongering? And if that's the case, how do you discern to people that that's not what people are trying to do? They're trying to genuinely be like, this is going to be the consequences of what you've decided to do.
Yeah, I think as people begin to wake up and realize they're going to want a second referendum, that's part one. Part two is, if you just look at Brexgrets, I think is what they're being called right now. There's actually polling organizations that are tracking regrets for their Brexit vote that they cast. For the first time in the last few months, I've watched the trend line cross over from those who were solidly pro-Brexit. Now we're seeing that, I think it's like 48-46 at the moment for remaining. And, that's starting to grow even further and further apart. I think it was in The Guardian this week that I saw the actual chart. And it's only going to get worse as people realize we're being led by fools. We're being led by people who do not have the ability to run this entire thing.
Just for the numbers, I pulled up one of the polls that was sort of put out in the last week or so, and it's I think it's from YouGov. It's ORB. So it's, do you agree or disagree with having greater control over immigration is more important than having access to free trade with the EU? So just at the start of November, end of October there, it crossed over. The only other time that there was more people thinking that we needed less controls over immigration to sacrifice for free trade is it's now 44% in favor of access with free trade, over 39% who think greater control over immigration is possible. So the tide is, I think, turning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the Standard, and this just came out. Oh no, that's older. There is a I had it the other day, and now I can't find it to save my life because, of course, we're live. But there was that poll that showed the switchover, and the businesses have been saying for some time they need some certainty. We need to delay anything to do with business for another 2 to 3 years beyond the point that we actually leave the union, so that we can keep the customs union and other things in place and then negotiate from there. But I mean, we haven't even agreed on the divorce bill yet. And, everybody keeps pushing that over to the side, or at least Britain tries to push it over the side. And, the EU has said, no, we need to know, we need to sort this out, and this needs to be paid before we're going to talk about trade or anything like that. And her government is going to fall. It's just a question of when over this, because they've just totally bollocksed it up. David Davis should not be leading it. He has absolutely no idea what he's doing, nor does she. And, they've kept Boris away from it. They're all in over their head. No one has ever negotiated a deal like this anywhere. And they've got amateurs running the shop who wouldn't know how to negotiate their way out of a paper bag.
Who would you have instead if you could choose from anyone? Would you take up Nigel's offer?
Nigel Farage, yeah. That he'll just put kerosene on everything and light a match. I mean, that's just the way he does things. I mean, from my perspective, I just think you admit defeat, which is something a politician never does. You go to a second referendum, or you just cancel it. You have that power and authority to do it, and just say, look, this is costing us way too much, and go from there. I mean, we're losing European headquarters. We're losing so much already, and that's all just jobs that are going to go away. And if you thought the decimation of the manufacturing sector was huge, wait until the financial sector, the automotive sector, the services sectors are all hit by this. And, it will bring a 1930s style depression to this particular part of the world, because we're not prepared for it. No one is prepared for it. everyone is just whistling past the graveyard.
Do you think there's a chance that it could be less damaging if we have that transition period? You know, if we manage to negotiate a reasonable deal, everyone's agreed. Basically, what I'm asking is if things had been done correctly in in terms of laying out plans for negotiations for like the future relationship, for the Brexit bill, if things had been done sort of more professionally, more amicably, and by people who seem to know what they're doing. Do you think there was there is or was a possibility that, you know, it wouldn't destroy the British economy?
No. I mean, it was ill-conceived. It was a breadcrumb thrown in the direction of the xenophobes and racists that says, you know, we're going to control immigration. And the key point behind anything that's done in the area of trade is that it's tied to open borders and free movement of people and immigration. So you're never going to get any kind of a trade deal as long as you simultaneously cling to this notion that you're going to control your borders in such a way that you already have the ability to do in terms of quotas and numbers. There's never been, you know, this has been the big thing this week. Name one bill that has been passed that Britain objected to that they could not have turned around and vetoed. And there's not one. In the however many years, was it 16 years we've been part of this union, there's not been one. So you got to ask yourself, at what point in time does it make sense for us to back away from this and say, this was foolish, we can't accomplish what we want, we're going to destroy our economy. You know, I keep running into people that are still stubbornly clinging to, you know, British laws and we're going to be controlling ourselves. You already had that control. You already had the ability to say no to something if it's expedient for you to do so, nor were your leaders willing to do so. So, you know, it's all just a paper tiger. There's nothing there.
Yeah, the immigration control thing is really, really baffles me actually at times, because you have a situation where prior to the referendum, there was an EU regulation that that Belgium had implemented, whereby if you wanted to go to Belgium as an EU citizen, you could go and travel there, you could go and live there and work there. But if you wanted to stay there for longer than 3 months without a job or money, you just couldn't. After 3 months of being in their country, they would be like, okay, so do you have a job or do you have funds to sustain yourself? And if you didn't have either of them, they were well within their rights to send you or try to send you home.
Yep.
And there was no reason that we couldn't have had that regulation put in place in Britain.
None whatsoever.
No.
None whatsoever. I mean, you know, there are a lot of people in UKIP, in, you know, the former British National Party, the EDF, and others that just they were putting all these false flag notions out there. And all it did was it gave people the permission to be openly racist. And I'm sorry, there should be no permission for that. There should be no tolerance of that. I mean, the number of Muslim people that were attacked and hurt in physical as well as economic ways after Brexit passed, they were taunted, they were jeered at, is ridiculous. And that is not the way you're supposed to behave if you're British. You're supposed to be open and accepting, and you know, the fact that these skinheads then had the ability to go and terrorize and taunt people and inflame their side, just like what you're seeing in the USA with the white supremacist groups, with you know, the KKK, with the Nazi skinheads there. There is no there should be zero tolerance for that type of behavior. But the simple fact of the matter is that they let people behave this way because they're afraid of them and they don't quite know how to handle a situation where so many aggrieved members of their own race are threatening to not vote for them. That's why you have the chaos in D.C. that you have right now.
I have a theory about some of the sort of anti-Muslim violence. About just I feel like some of it gets caused, and I'm not excusing, violence is never ever the answer ever, but I feel like some of the violence has been caused by the inability of politicians or the media to understand when people are trying to make more nuanced arguments about their fears about the compatibility of, say, the Saudi Arabian regime and, you know, what they believe in, or in Qatar, like more fundamentalist Islamic governments and their compatibility with, you know, liberal Western democracies. And I feel like that conversation isn't one that gets had enough, and that some of the kind of backlash and outrage against people from the Islamic faith is kind of caused by the inability to have that conversation, because it's very, very easy for people to just immediately point the finger and be like, look, you're being racist. And then the conversation gets shut down, and then you get sort of the feelings sort of bubbling under the surface, and then when they become a bit more extreme, then they start to bubble over, and then you get this level of sort of anti-Muslim rhetoric or anti-immigrant rhetoric.
Yeah, and there's no easy way out, because once it starts, you know, you've got people that are afraid, you know, for their own safety, if you're seen as showing support for these particular groups. So I don't know where the answer lies with this one, but it is not the type of situation that's going to be easily solved, and it is just going to get worse as far as I'm concerned, because you've got so many people that are living in so much fear of the so-called brown-skinned other that it becomes extraordinarily difficult to even you know, figure out where you're going to be, where you're going to be standing, and it is a mess that's just continuing to grow with pretty much every group out there.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll see what happens ultimately. I can't say I have the answer either, but we'll move on to something that you maybe have more of an idea about. So in one of your latest podcasts, you talk about your book. Well, yeah. Do you want to talk about what your book is first, and then I'll ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've got a book out now called Donald Trump Deplorable Bully, and the subtitle is 45 Shameful Weeks of POTUS 45, and POTUS standing for President of the United States. What I've done with this book is try to put together a timeline version of events that helps people understand where Trump came from and what he is doing. And a lot of people don't want to read about, you know, what has already happened. But my contention is you've forgotten so much now that you've normalized a lot of his behavior. One of the statements I make fairly early on in the book is that a month in Trump life is like a dog's year, because so much happens, and so much of it is outrageous, and so much of it is diversionary in nature. You can't keep up with all the changes and everything that's going on out there. And we start all the way back. And as a matter of just historical reference, Josh, I wrote a book 5 years ago now, on the 2012 campaign, which was a quote unquote normal campaign, because I'm making air quotes as though people can see what I'm actually doing here, but
it was the most expensive in history until the last one, wasn't it? It was
well, the last one wasn't as expensive, believe it or not, because Trump didn't spend as much money. He didn't have to.
It would have been 2012 then was the most expensive of all time
to date. Yeah, about $7 billion for all races, but the presidential race, which is usually the most expensive, Trump only spent a few $100 million. He did not spend anywhere over $1 billion, which is what Obama had to do to maintain his seat. And during that time, 4 to 5 years ago, I was able to look at issues. I was able to look at the 7 candidates that were standing, and you could draw some pretty good conclusions and talk about the war on women, the gerrymandering and the effects of that. And you could produce, and I did. I produced 4 relatively short 60 to 70 page ebooks that then came into a single volume at the end called The Billionaire Billionaire Boys Election Freak Show. Now, that was a good piece for that time. And the intention was at the start of 2015 to do the same thing. Well, right out of the bat in 2015, we had 17 candidates. And by the time we got into 2016 with the actual primaries underway, it became a reality game show. Who's going to be the survivor? Who's going to be the last person left on the island? Trump got that, and he waged a campaign that was completely different. And I talk about this in the book, where if you look at what happened to Jeb Bush, for example, he raised $100 million in establishment money, and most people thought he was probably going to have some difficulties in both Iowa and New Hampshire. Those are the first two states, the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. Because
if you're gonna win the nomination, you have to win. You have to win one of them.
Well, or just place well enough to be able to continue. Because a lot of people don't win either of them, because that's where the most identity politic candidates show up and do well. So those that have, basically the batshit crazy candidate, and the one who's the loudest, is the one who wins in Iowa. And not too far removed is New Hampshire. By the time you get to South Carolina, which is the week after, that's where the firewall begins to build for the candidate who's going to win, because those are traditional Republican voters. And by that point in time, you can recover from anything that's happened in New Hampshire or anything that's happened in Iowa, and really begin to stake your claim to building and going forward from there. And both George W. and George H.W. Bush did poorly in Iowa and New Hampshire, a little bit better in New Hampshire, but then crushed in South Carolina. So the goal was to raise as much money as he could. He raised $100 million, which for a primary effort is a tremendous amount of money for three states. And he might as well have taken that pile of money, walked into an open field, and set it ablaze for the good it did for him. I mean, he lost badly in Iowa, which was expected to do, but he finished, I think, 5th or 6th in New Hampshire. And he did even worse in South Carolina. And by the time South Carolina was over, he was out of the campaign. And it was one of those situations where you look at, well, if the main establishment candidate, the Mitt Romney of 2016, could not do well, this was going to be a very different year. And you began to look at people like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. They all went up against the reality television show host, and he crushed them because he didn't campaign the way you're supposed to. He didn't play the game the way they wanted him to play it. So before long, they were in deep, deep doo-doo, and they didn't know how to get out. And it was one of those situations where I took the book and said, okay, I talked briefly about it at the very beginning, but I start the timeline 2 weeks before the actual election, when the October surprise from James Comey occurred. And with that October surprise, we saw that this Clinton email had come out. She had been cruising at that point to victory. She was out of the debates unscathed, gathering support left, right, and center. But the moment the Comey letter came out, that's when they were in trouble. So Comey comes out with this letter that basically says that there's still some issues with Clinton's emails. And you can literally track the poll movement from that point straight down. It was the classic October surprise in an American presidential election. She never recovered from it. And despite winning 3 million more popular votes than him, the election actually, was about an 80,000 vote affair in 4 key states that had she won them, she would have done a hell of a lot better. And, what I do is I start from there, go through the election, go through then the transition, which was shorter because the election was later in the cycle. And then we then go from the election to Inauguration Day. And that starts the first 100 days, and that's the typical yardstick by which a president is measured. His dystopian inaugural address, the gathering of millions of women the day after to protest him in the Women's March, and the simple fact that as he built his cabinet, it was the anti-cabinet. Every person that was put in charge of an agency basically was tasked to destroy the agency and make certain it wasn't there anymore. And we talk about those dystopian first 100 days and his use of Twitter. Then we go to the second 100 days, which included 2 international trips where he embarrassed himself. And he's just now come back today from an even more embarrassing trip to Asia. And we talk a little bit about Russia, but we don't really dive deeply into it because a lot was still not known at that point, other than it was very clear that something had happened. And we get to day 230, which was the day that the DACA kids were told, well, you may not be able to stay. And suddenly Hurricane Harvey hit down in Houston, Texas. That's where we ended the book. 22 days later, it was out, and it has been out since then. And we're just now looking at it. I mean, as soon as I put it out, I was tweeting to folks, and Bruce Bartlett, who was with the Reagan administration, he was his domestic policy advisor, said, well, you're probably already working on volume 2, aren't you? Yeah. I mean, I've already got half a book, and we're only 50 days further on because he's just gotten more absurd with every moment. So, this will be volume 2, probably coming out sometime next year, hopefully when he's indicted or when he's impeached, one or the other.
I think there's probably more chance of an indictment than an impeachment.
Well, as long as you have control, and his party has control of the House and the Senate, yeah, impeachment's going to be tough. You're seeing that they're already supporting a admitted pedophile, for the United States Senate in Moore in Alabama. And, even the establishment Republicans have said the guy's got to go, but he's still there. And
let's not, well, to quote, to paraphrase Marco Rubio, let's not pretend that, the establishment Republicans don't know what they're doing here, and they're trying to finally grow a moral backbone. They know exactly what they're doing. They're protesting a guy who was supported by Steve Bannon, who they are not a fan of. It's got nothing to do with the actual moral implications of it. It's who it is. But I wanted to ask you about the sort of normalization aspect that you talk about in your book, that it's really key not to forget things, and it really is very difficult in an era where there's like this is part of what made Trump successful, is the just sort of endless cartwheel of chaos and outrageous statements, and he's just an enigma, to probably put it in the nicest way I could. And I'm really, really interested to see what comes post Trump, because there's a core of his base that really hasn't shifted for 6-7 months. It's about 35% or so, give or take. And regardless of what he does, that doesn't seem to shift. And I feel like and obviously this isn't saying, Dennis, don't write your book. This is at all. I love the fact that people are taking the time to say, look, this is why this is dangerous for democracy and civilization. But by preaching to people who are in that sort of Trump world, in that mindset, that by attacking them in the way that they feel attacked by people, they sort of double down further and refuse to let in ideas that maybe they made a mistake in voting for Trump, or maybe he isn't all he sort of pretended he was, or maybe isn't everything that they believed he was. And how do you think we reconcile the idea of making sure we don't normalize his presidency with trying to bring some of these people back to the real world, essentially?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, and you'd be silly to waste your time at this point. It'd be like trying to convince a rabid Nigel Farage supporter to come back. All right. They're too far gone. And I mean that with all sincerity. And by them, I'm talking about the roughly 30%, because it's not even that many, that are his rabid supporters. I'm interested in the 10%, now about 6%, that are leaning away from him, but haven't quite jumped the shark, as we say. That there's still some hope for them to come around to, this isn't working. There was an election 2 weeks ago in the United States, and it was astonishing how well not just Democrats and progressives did, but people of color, LGBT. We saw a broad grassroots appeal. And they came out and they voted in these off-year elections for governor in Virginia, the entire state assembly, which is basically their local House of Parliament, and in pretty much every community across the. I just saw yesterday that after a recount, a young Democratic woman won a seat in the Oklahoma state Senate. That is as red a state as exists. Trump won that state by 40 points, and yet a Democratic woman just won a seat in the Oklahoma Senate. And I don't think you can discount everything that is happening there, because it's grassroots, and if people show up, then things start to change. And these become very important elections going forward, because you're going to be facing something in 2020 called the every decade census. And as a result of that census, we see where population has migrated to, and some states lose representatives in Congress, some states gain representatives based on how much population has shifted from one state to another. So typically, a northern Rust Belt state's likely to lose a seat, whereas a southern growth state will gain. And the ability to take state legislatures is critical. And that all started with the Koch brothers and the Republicans when they ended up 2016 with 30 state legislatures under Republican control, meaning they can continue to gerrymander, and no matter how well the Democrats do overall in a state, they'll still end up with less seats because of the way the districts are carved so that they favor Republicans. They make a lot of Republican safe seats. These are the issues that are simmering underneath the surface, not whether or not I can convince a Trump supporter, to come back from the dark side. I'm not even going to try. I want to talk to the people that are the independents, the ones in the middle, the ones who voted for him for the first time and are extraordinarily disappointed. The first time they've ever voted Republican, first time they've ever voted for somebody for change. And now they're extraordinarily disappointed with the direction he's taking the country. You have an unpopular candidate in Trump. You had an even more unpopular candidate in Clinton. And we've seen this time and again. You don't vote against somebody. You vote for somebody. And if you can't find a reason to vote for a candidate, you're not going to play the game. And this is why Trump won in 2016. But once they began to see how poorly he has operated, he's going to lose in 2017, and more importantly, in the midterms in 2018. And, that's when people start to get excited at the prospect of, just run for something that was a new initiative by the Democrats. And people won seats who had never thought they would win before. So there's some good stuff there.
Yeah, there's really been an explosion of down ballot candidates for the Democrats anyway. I was wondering to what extent you thought the victory in the elections last week were kind of a combination of sort of everything but Trump, essentially, in that there was people who maybe didn't want to vote for Trump and either abstained or voted Trump because they thought Clinton was such a poor candidate. That there was it's an off-year election with an unpopular Republican president, and that just traditionally swings towards the other party in these sorts of situations. And the fact that you have had such an explosion of kind of grassroots people wanting to run, because not solely because of Trump, but more because people are just like, I could do a better job than these idiots. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had that thought at one point in their life. And people who have more experience and more expertise, more involvement in their own community and sort of roots there might just be like, you know what, I could do this better. And to what extent do you think all those factors kind of stack up more than like the anti-Trump vote as such? You feel free to disagree with me and say that it's all Trump. Where do you think that sort of lies?
I think Trump is the lightning rod. He is the person that has finally awakened what Nixon used to call the great silent majority. There's a huge number of people that have watched what he has done and are absolutely stunned that he won, and then looking at what he said versus what he's done, are in a position to now want to make a significant change because they can't stand dealing with or watching him. So it's only going to continue to grow.
I had just one other question. You were saying higher about how you feel that you're not really that interested in talking to the sort of extreme Trump cult, or however you want to describe them. But would you have said the same thing about George W. Bush supporters?
I did.
You did?
I mean,
do you think it's the same people?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. I mean, as much as I disliked his supporters, they weren't anywhere near as extreme as Trump supporters have been. When I say don't waste your time, we're coming up on a very big holiday in the United States. And for progressives, last year, it was disastrous. This year, they'll feel a little bit more cocky. But Thanksgiving Day is when families traditionally come together. And nobody wants to talk politics because it rips families apart. I have seen the results of this Trump election not just rip families apart, but friendships apart. And my motto is very simple. I'm not going to try to convince somebody who is truly a Trump supporter to try and come across to our side. I'll spend hours talking to a true independent because they want to know and they're confused. And I think that's where every political party, and it doesn't matter where you are. I was a member of the Liberal Democrats for a little over a year while I stood for the Welsh Assembly here. And nobody likes the smartest person in the room, okay? You've got to be in a position to not only be smart, but to connect empathetically and emotionally with people, because all politics is emotional and all politics is retail. And during the campaign in 2016, when we were, here also 6 weeks before Brexit, there was no way you were going to convince people of anything. The only thing they cared about was something the Welsh Assembly couldn't do a damn thing about, and that was Brexit. Where do you stand on Brexit? Where do you stand on Brexit? And it actually was Europe at that point. Where do you stand on Europe? And they couldn't see any need to have a discussion about the Assembly, where it was headed and what it was going to do.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess it's kind of you have to let people come to their own conclusion on something like that. That you have to, if it's someone, I was reading a thing where someone had described it like trying to deprogram someone when they like fervently believe just in like one figure or one politician or one ideology. And that they said that there's aside from like mental torture or like screaming at them and putting them in a room and just like beating them until they, read the debunking article about why Trump was wrong, or, that sort of thing, that you have to let people come to their own conclusions. And the only way that, because if you try and like just go in there with like people are just going to get defensive and they'll double down. They have to come to their own conclusions about it.
Well, and most of them already have, and that's part of the problem. They've already come to their own conclusions about who Trump is, what he does. I mean, the evangelicals are absolutely ridiculous because they're the ones that are, so supporting him in everything he says and does. Yet he is the antithesis of what a good Christian is, and they won't leave him alone. Indeed, there's 56 pastors that came out in support of this former judge. His name is Moore, who's running for the Senate in that runoff in December in Alabama.
12th,
and now most of those posters want to get their names taken off of the letter they signed. So, I mean, they're finding themselves, and justifiably so, in a real pickle because they're supporting, as evangelical Christians, a most unchristian human being. So you find yourself going, well, wait a minute, what's wrong here?
Yeah, it's. I guess I'm just interested to see at what point the tide turns for Republicans in Congress and where they will stand. Like, so when they stop trying to defend him, essentially, because I think while his approval rating, I just looked on the 538 tracker there for his approval rating. So they have it at 55.8% disapprove, 38.1% approval. So when they're talking about it, they always discuss that when Nixon was impeached, his approvals were at 25%. So Trump still has a little way to go until we get there.
Yeah, and I don't think, I mean, the reason you see Mueller going so carefully is he is building a case brick by brick. And, let's remember here, Mueller is a registered Republican. He was appointed to the FBI by a Republican president. So the guy is, and by the way, the guy who then gave him control of the investigation works for a Republican attorney general and himself is a Republican. So when they say that this is just a Democratic plot.
I know that makes me, was it Rod Rosenstein? Was it?
Yeah, Rod Rosenstein. Yeah. And he's, I mean, they're going to go as far as they have to go to get answers. And what's happening now is this guy Mueller is working not just on the financial transactions. He's working hand in hand with the IRS to try and figure out where the money's hidden, what was hidden, where, when, and why. He's also working hand in hand with the New York State Attorney General, who is looking into issues because there have been whispers about illegal dealings forever. So even if Trump takes the extraordinary measure of pardoning everyone associated, including his own family, that only absolves them of crimes at the federal level. There's stuff that's happening at the state level. There's stuff that's happening with the IRS that will happen because they can seize assets and do whatever they have to do. So there's no way he wriggles out of this just with an executive pardon. I don't think even he understands that. He seems to think a pardon's a pardon and I'll be fine no matter what. No, you won't. And the longer Mueller continues to look at the ties between Russia, the way he handled the brilliant situation with unsealing indictments against Manafort and his associate, his business associate. And he waited. You could see him sitting in his office going, okay, here it comes. 3, 2, 1. Trump tweets. See, I told you, no Russia collusion anywhere. Boom. Papadopoulos.
Yeah, that was very.
It's like anyone can play him just by coddling up to his ego or waiting for him to do what you know he's going to do, which will be something completely stupid and against the advice of counsel. And they're just going to have fun. This is like the cat that's already caught the mouse and is sitting there holding it by the tail and just playing with it and batting it around. That's what they're going to do to Trump. And, when they come out with the real stuff, which is that Russia interfered with the election, that it, did this and that, and step by step, that 30 whatever something percent will drop just as it did with Dick Nixon, and.
Well, I guess we'll see what happens. There's just two, yeah, it's going to be interesting because, well, there's a lot of whilst there's a lot of dots, there's still some blanks that need to be filled in as to exactly what happened. So it'll be, I'm intrigued. There's one post I would recommend to anyone listening, and I'll put it in the description. And it was the author escapes me right now, but it was on LinkedIn Pulse, and it was this massive, lengthy background story into Russian ties to the mob and between Trump and mobsters in like Florida and in Russia and from like throughout the 80s, the 90s, right up to today, explaining like where the connections came from.
Yeah.
And it really gives you if you step back and kind of try and get your head around the amount of different like ties there are between like Trump circle and Russian mobsters and money laundering and just Paul Manafort, who's a shady guy in general. Robert Mercer, Cambridge Analytica.
The Dutch also did a superb job of this. There's a television program, a current affairs program there called Zembla. That's Zembla, mm-hmm. And Zander Rietveld is the reporter. And these were so big that they recorded them in traditional Dutch, but then they also did English versions of it. So they hired a narrator in English to come in and tell the story. And anytime somebody spoke on camera in a foreign language, they put English subtitles underneath it, because he basically makes all the ties between, the Soho building and Felix Sater and his involvement in the Trump administration and following the money all around the globe. And then, the blood diamond market, the post boxes in the Netherlands and how those trusts were used. And they've done 3 episodes around the dubious friends of Donald Trump. That's the name of it. And they're well worth the basically 2 hours it takes to watch all 3 versions, maybe 2.5 hours, because you again get from a foreign perspective, these guys were in the States investigating, trying to talk to everybody that was involved. And we've had Sander on the podcast, Sander Rietveld. He came back around the time of the first ones, well before the election. And, he's very, very good and very, very thorough as an investigative journalist. And there are people, the only reason this has gotten as far as it has is because we still have strong investigative journalists at the Washington Post, the New York Times, and several other magazines that just are like dogs with bones. They continue to dig, and they will not be satisfied, nor will Mueller or anybody else. And the other thing is that Mueller is a career prosecutor. He doesn't leak. Nobody on his team leaks. All right, the guy ran the FBI. He's got his hand-picked team, but it's the dream team. It's the dream team on money laundering. It's the dream team on, IRS-related issues. It's the dream team on cash payments. I mean, every person leading every aspect of this knows what they are doing. And the reason it's taking so long is they are building one hell of an airtight case around this.
Yeah, if anyone has any doubt as to the competency of Robert Mueller, then I would, and sort of the way he's going about the investigation, I would advise them to look at the Enron case that he was a major part of back was it the late 90s, early 2000s?
Yeah.
And that just the way they wrapped people up there, the guy is ruthless and relentless, and if there is a smoking gun to be had, Robert Mueller is the man to find it.
Yeah. I mean, he is the quintessential prosecutor. And the fact that Rosenstein brought him in, I thought that was genius. They said, look, I'm going to bring in somebody who's completely unimpeachable. He had Comey's job before Comey. So, either if there's something wrong with him doing this, then we've had a problem with the FBI. And the FBI is extraordinarily proud, and they have reason to be because of the way they've done it, the way they've, performed, and the way they've handled investigations and everything else.
Well, anyway, I know you have to run, so I think we can leave it there.
Okay. It's so funny. At least we don't have any. We won't have any more phones ringing or any other interruptions. Apologies for that.
That's all right. No problem.
Yeah.
But your book is out now. We will put the link in the description.
Thank you.
And yeah, the links to that Zembla, the dubious friends of Donald Trump, and that LinkedIn Pulse piece that I talked about. So yeah, people have plenty of reading to do. But yes.
Which of course is what they always want to do.
Well, yeah, exactly. Maybe I'm odd. I do love a good
for your homework.
Yeah. I just love a good rabbit hole. Maybe that's my problem. Anyway, yeah. Thanks very much for chatting to me again. And,
pleasure, as always.
I hope the book sales go well.
Thank you. Well, opportunities like this to talk about it are always very helpful.
Thanks very much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Stitcher. Next week, we've got interviews with Carrick Flynn about his work on the governance of AI and how you write AI policy, and with Daz from Skank FM, one of Belfast's independent radio stations. So until next time, thanks very much for listening.